and I would love to hear your take on some of the deportations that have happened at universities. One thing that I wonder about is, to what degree are these deportation targets evidence of, for example, a hostile environment? That is, professors who have certain views that are connected to Hezbollah, for example, the professor from Brown, who I think a med school professor or someone associated with the medical school, with the hospital system at Brown, who traveled to see the Hezbollah leader's funeral and so on, was found to have pictures of this person on their phone, had a claim of a religious connection to that person, but there's also need to be a political connection to a designated terrorist group. Are these things? How do you think of the deportation cases? Are they part of the case for the Title VI actions? Are they a separate set of issues? What's your read?
Well, the government is looking at this from a couple different perspectives. The first perspective is that it is saying that it has the authority to remove anyone who they think poses a national security threat. So that rationale isn't tied to Title VI at all. We think you're posing a national security threat.
So I'm a professor and I'm a member of Al Qaeda, and I swear allegiance to their cause of violence, whatever it might be, and that's a designated terrorist group, for example.
Right.
My academic freedom wouldn't give me any protection.
Special protection. That you happen to be a professor is no different than if you had been a plumber or an electrician.
Or a pilot.
Or a pilot. If you're actively engaged in terrorism or providing material support for terrorism, then that is something totally different. But ordinarily, you still have to have some amount of evidence before you remove someone that they are, in fact, engaged in those activities.
And being a member of such a group wouldn't be considered enough for deportation?
I think being a member of a terrorist organization,
designated terrorist
organization is enough. But agreeing with a terrorist organization and saying, you know what, I really, think that such and such group's cause is a just one.
A one-state solution is a just cause, for example.
Writing an op-ed that makes that case is not the kind of support for terrorism that any of the statutes, contemplate. And the Supreme Court, when it talks about material support, has to elevate it beyond just pure speech to get into actual, conduct that actually aids the terrorist activities. So what you have here is a mixture of two different rationales. There's that national security rationale that we just talked about. But then there's this rationale that the government is claiming that some of these individuals, through their involvement at the institutions, have created a hostile environment in violation of Title VI. And what I would say to all of this, because there are a lot of different layers of this that I hope that we touch on. We can't ignore the due process aspects of it, as well, which I hope to get to. But what I want to stick on for the moment first is just the claim that merely expressing agreement, whether it's at a protest or through an op-ed, itself is enough to have created a hostile environment. And what I would say is, you can't have open inquiry if the idea is there are some views that are so offensive that students should be shielded from. And that's straight out of the Chicago Statement Principles on Free Speech. So that's not the role of universities to shield people from ideas. But you do have people who engage in behaviors that are clearly not protected. You have situations like the occupations of buildings, vandalisms. You have physical confrontations where people have been, assaulted.
Right.
There were protesters who taped a sign on the window of University of Pennsylvania President Dr. Jameson's, home early in the morning, saying that we're watching you. All acts of intended, intimidation. Certainly, the people who are engaged in those behaviors could be subject to discipline and could possibly even be removed. And the way I think about it—
Sorry, you mean if they're non-residents, they could be deported?
Right. Or expelled if they're citizens. My
Expelled from the university.
right, expelled from the university. Yes, I should be
Sorry,
clear
are you
about
talking
that.
about university actions now or government actions?
Yeah, I was mixing the two,
Mm,
and I didn't mean to be imprecise. When I talk about removal, I'm talking about the government action of removing someone. When I talk about expulsion, I'm talking about the institution.
good.
And the way I think it through is if the person is accused of doing something that's criminal behavior, that should be initiated not by the institution but by the government, and the government should be saying should bring charges, and if they've been found guilty of those charges, that could put their visas in jeopardy, and if they lose their visas, the school should not continue having them there. If, on the other hand, it's an infraction of a school rule, a a protest where there was a heckler's veto. Now, first of all, that should be actionable. That's punishable. It's not protected speech. And it's important that schools enforce those rules, evenly. But I differentiate personally between someone who gets involved in a protest that gets out of hand and actually physically assaulting people in a protest. I don't want them treated with the identical penalty. I don't want an 18-year-old to not have an opportunity to learn from any mistakes that they make. So,
Right.
but if a student were to do things like occupying a library or physically striking another, you know, person at a protest or things like that, and the school were to expel them, uh, then that would subject them to losing their visa because their visa is conditioned on them being enrolled in the school. And I would lose no sleep with the government removing them under those circumstances, provided they went through the ordinary procedures that give people notice and opportunity to challenge them and not grabbed on the street, arrested, put on planes, and put in jail cells somewhere with the government trying to remove them as quickly as they can before they can get lawyers to fill
Right.
out paperwork.
Let me ask you that same case now on the other side of it. What about a state of affairs where there are professors and students, let's say, on the campus who are holding these beliefs, engaged in these activities, and the campus does not step in to expel them. The campus does not remove them from the community. They don't do that. Is that evidence that there's an environment that's hostile?
I think that could be evidence of a hostile environment. That's
So
part of
titles. So there's questions. So there's a set of legal questions about when deportation is appropriate. Then there's a set of questions about if a university administration fails to protect the community of learners, that is in the sense of allowing a hostile environment to emerge and to continue. That would be that would be the case if the government comes in through Title
well,
VI.
so Title VI can only be violated by the institutions. Title VI says
They allow the environment.
institutions may not have an environment. So obviously,
So if they allow people who create that environment,
so
they're
if they're being deliberately indifferent by turning a blind eye to the occupation of buildings, to the harassment of Jewish students every time they try to enter Hillel, we can think of a number of different ways that they could be deliberately indifferent. Then the federal government's remedy against the institution is to hold them accountable with all the financial levers that we were talking about. Immigration enforcement is not one of the enforcement mechanisms
okay.
under Title VI,
Okay, good.
but the national security rationale might be.
Okay, good.
What they're saying is they're saying we're going to get rid of anyone who supports, Hamas, and they're
Good.
using the word support, which is so vague and broad. They're not talking about material support; they're just saying support, which could be I agree. You know, and at least with the student from who was arrested from Tufts, the evidence out there is at the moment is just an op-ed that she co-wrote, criticizing the university for not divesting. Now, uh,
Not
it,
divesting from Israel.
from not divesting from Israel.
So this
So
person was advocating a BDS position regarding
right, right,
investments.
in an op-ed co-written by other student leaders, and that's the only evidence that's been shown publicly so far. So I don't want to rule out the possibility that any one of these individuals on a case by case basis might not have engaged in behavior or may have engaged in behavior that would trigger additional action. But it certainly cannot be on the basis of just expressing general opinions on these topics and still have an environment of open inquiry. And that's ultimately why we at HXA are so concerned about this, is because we don't want anyone who's here on a student visa or teaching on a visa to have to worry about what arguments may I make
Right.
You know,
That's
we
right.
do want them to worry about, are we going to not actually be disruptive?